everyone for being a little late. So it's very nice to get the invitation to talk about this topic. Several years ago, I wrote a paper on what I called positive art. So I'm just going to try and run through this, and like I say, in about half an hour, and then just leave space for discussion and questions. Um, Art is a topic that I've long been fascinated with personally and professionally. I'm not a scholar of art. This is just my attempt to engage with it academically. Um, I should just say, as a brief bit of context, in my 20s, I was a musician, like a professional musician. I didn't make much money, but I spent my 20s trying to be a professional musician. Would have loved that to have been my career, although it's probably not sustainable long term. But just deeply kind of invested and interested in art, and particularly music. Um, but I've also become interested in thinking about visual arts too. My dad was a teacher for most of his career, but lately he's been a volunteer guide at the V&A, and I've had some wonderful conversations with him about the nature of art. And really, what I tried to do with this paper is to kind of celebrate it in terms of its potential for well-being and flourishing. So that's why the subtitle of the paper in this presentation, Artistic Expression and Appreciation as an Exemplary Vehicle for Flourishing. Um, so my background is in positive psychology. I'm sure people might know that in some respects. Broadly speaking, you could look at that as the science and practice of improving well-being. And as you probably also know, there's been various hybrid or subfields developed in relation to positive psychology, positive education, things like that. So inspired by that, I wanted to propose this idea of positive art, really as a way of a centralizing place to bring together scholarship that already exists, on the value of art. So really at the intersection of positive psychology and art. So the relevance of art engagement for well-being. And like I say, there's obviously been work through the decades, through the centuries, obviously, in fields like aesthetics and philosophy. So there's a space to try and bring this together and appreciate the value of art. Obviously, this has been perhaps harnessed more specifically in terms of helping treat or alleviate mental health issues, various forms of art and music and drama and play therapy and so on. But what this paper tried to do was, as with positive psychology more generally, just to say that actually, you know, even outside those therapeutic modalities, art is really, I think, one of the main ways in which people seek and experience and cultivate well-being in their lives. Um, so in the paper, I try to think about art in terms of, I organize the literature really in terms of the four main modalities. So visual art, painting, sculpture, photography, etc. Music, whether that's playing, singing, dancing, literature, novels, poetry, and then drama. And then what I tried to do across these different artistic modalities was try and say that there's five main categories of benefits. I don't like to use benefits, it sounds instrumental, but five main things that they can do for well-being, which I think are very valuable. This list isn't necessarily exhaustive. I didn't do a systematic literature review or anything. This is just my own narrative engagement with the topic. But I suggested there could be at least five main channels. One would be sense making, so helping people comprehend existence and find meaning in it. Um, Enriching experience, so really facilitating new or elevated emotional states. Aesthetic appreciation, so just the sheer enjoyment of beauty or skill. Entertainment, so just pleasure and fun. And then bonding, so socially we're connecting with others through art. So the way I structure the paper and the way I'll try and just structure this presentation is to think about each of the main artistic modalities through the prism of these five channels. So I'm going to try and keep a track of time and I'll try and make sure I get through all the slides. So visual art, beginning now, obviously that's a constant throughout human history, dates back tens of thousands of years. We find art dating back at least that far. Serves various purposes. Could be petitioning representations of desired outcomes or vehicles for shamanic mystic experiences or just representing the world we find around. So depictions of celestial star systems and so on could also be a medium for religious and spiritual traditions and still is a vehicle for existential and spiritual yearnings in that respect. So we find examples of cave art dating back at least 40,000 BCE. So, in terms of the first kind of category of value or benefit, one of them is sense making. So, visual art can help us articulate messages of existential importance, providing opportunities to reflect on these. So, obviously, we find that in religious iconography, helping to articulate uh, teachings in religious and spiritual traditions. You know, one can find examples like Picasso reflecting on the chaos and fragmentation of the 20th century. Lots of theories have been developed to try and, elucidate the way in which art can help us in that respect. So, like the effort after meaning theory. So, part of the reward of viewing art lies in interpreting and decoding it. So, in this respect, art therapy has been used. Sense making has been used, um, or can captured in art therapy, helping people process and find meaning in their distress. And it can be particularly valuable for people who might struggle with language for various reasons. Visual art can also enrich experience, like adding new depth, texture, and color to reality, opening up new emotional and existential vistas. So, a good example, right, is the 1968 Earthrise photo. There it is. I'm sure you've seen that before. Um, so powerful. So, taken by the Apollo 8 astronauts. Lots has been written about this in terms of like consciousness raising of humankind, and Williamson even said it's the most significant legacy of the space age, realizing there we are in this kind of fragile pale blue dot, as Sagan put it, hovering there in space. So things like this, it's help us to appreciate who we are as people, and the nature of existence. New technologies have helped this, democratizing art production, helping people understand their lived experiences. So there's a good example of a study involving adolescents with chronic health problems using visual art to understand their lives and their conditions. Obviously, a key aspect of visual art is aesthetic appreciation. So, visual beauty can invoke positive mental states. That's obviously central to the philosophical field of aesthetics. And it's been embraced in positive psychology, for example, in terms of the values in action, taxonomy of character strengths, where appreciation of beauty and excellence is one of the key strengths. Um, so it's been analyzed, for example, in terms of its ability to induce awe and facilitate transformative experiences. And obviously, visual art has great popular appeal. So, whether that's in terms of visiting galleries, home decoration, blogs around aesthetic appreciation, and so on. Visual art is obviously just entertaining in a sense. It can be just a pleasant distraction or an engrossing intellectual experience. There's a nice study there about kind of workers in the City of London just visiting a gallery in their lunch hour, experiencing reduced cortisol and self-reported stress. There's kind of entertainment's probably the wrong label here, but there's value in creating art. So you probably know Csikszentmihalyi's work on flow. So flow can be found in creating and or just experiencing art. It can satisfy basic psychological needs like freedom and autonomy. And just to make the point, it's not just for like artists, but anyone can get value, even just in doing art. You see some pictures behind me, in fact, coincidentally. My 3-year-old daughter was just doing that yesterday and had a great afternoon just messing around with paints. So, don't have to be an artist to enjoy not just appreciating art, but making art. And there's obviously lots been done in terms of art interventions in the community. Then also bonding. So besides those other values, there's a sense of connection and interconnectedness through art. Perhaps that's in terms of the shared humanity, like the Earthrise photo, or facilitating forms of national and regional identity. I'm sure whichever country people are from, there might be a local artist that seems to capture something about who they are as who the culture and who they are as a people. Um, they can help facilitate intimate relationships, and especially this is enhanced really with art-based new media like Instagram. Obviously, Instagram is problematic in lots of ways, but there's positive potentials too in terms of the way it allows people to either express themselves or experience art. And similarly with kind of innovations like video games, there's potential there for bonding in relation to visual art. Okay, so just moving swiftly on to music, so I really want to touch in, if I can, with all the different artistic modalities. Like with visual art, this is really a constant throughout human history. There's lots of work done on the notion of music language, where uh, music essentially could be seen as a forerunner or kind of intertwined with the emergence of language in humankind. It's a vehicle for oral histories and memories. It's central to religious and spiritual traditions. Uh, it's been explored and embraced in esoteric philosophies like Pythagoras with his harmony of the spheres, with harmonic properties in musical instruments, reflective of some kind of cosmic harmony that one could even hear if one was sufficiently attuned. You can play a ceremonial role, symbolic role, for example, protest songs or national anthems, and so on. So again, just to run through those different categories of value, uh, music can be a prism through which life can be interpreted. In religious context, for example, it can give voice to spiritual feelings and experiences. It's foundational to cultural myths and stories passed, which are often passed orally down through music. It's there in the formation of personal identity, affiliation to subcultures, how one thinks of oneself, one's friendship groups, and how one positions oneself in the world. And again, it helps people make sense of their experiences, as you might find in resource-oriented therapy. Obviously, it's particularly powerful, enriching experience and inducing intense emotions, as you see this written about by Nietzsche, um, facilitating what, spiritual trance or ecstasy. And then, especially if you bring in things associated with music like dance and singing, people have sought to, for example, study physiologically how it might occur. So the chills when you get goosebumps in your skin. So work on like involving the neuroaffective circuitry involved in pleasure and reward, like endorphin bursts, and what might precipitate that, like inharmonic change, where a note could stay the same, but the kind of tonal structure around it could shift. Um, and people have talked about music as being kind of music self-medication, where it helps people self-regulate their mood. If they can anticipate how a piece of music is going to affect them, then they might choose to listen to that music in a way to hopefully achieve the kind of mental states they would want to have. Aesthetic appreciation. So, for example, there's music appreciation in liberal arts education as a gateway to more general aesthetic appreciation. There's areas of literature like the Mozart effect, where supposedly listening to classical music helps one's cognitive development. Uh, it's a bit contentious. Some people think that the idea has been overhyped, but meta-analyses suggest there could be some validity that kind of the complex patterns found in music, if exposed to these in like childhood and infancy, that can help to an extent with cognitive development. It can help with neurological cognitive rehabilitation. So again, the nature of the sound environment and the information conveyed there can help people with their cognitive development. Also used in clinical settings, for example, around aesthetic appreciation, music use therapy for substance use disorder, for example. Obviously, music is central to just entertainment. Here, we just want to mention dancing, for example. Um, it's a favored pastime among many people. You know, there's obviously important, symbolic elements to it in terms of forming identity. There's also the potential for dance to elicit rarefied states, physiological and psychological states. There's health benefits too, but there's also just the sheer fun factor of dancing. So Lindquist suggested it's the closest many adults come to the freedom of play, and it can be, particularly relevant to hard to reach populations who might be disengaged from other forms of art. And again, it can help people experience beneficial, rewarding states such as flow. And then also bonding. So, especially in adolescence and growing up, a large part of our identity and our friendship groups can be oriented around musical groups, musical scenes, and so on. Um, Bonding might be especially facilitated in live performance, so it can evoke kind of collective emotionality, states of euphoria. There's also kind of in a meaningful, symbolic way, potential for political consciousness raising and so on. Then bonding also can be particularly powerful when one's playing music with other people, the kind of collective flow and participatory consciousness, and even a kind of intersubjective wholeness. That's like been studied, for example, in relation to choral singing. Okay, moving on to thinking about literature. So obviously, this has been constant throughout human history. Um, Perhaps the earliest surviving text that we have is the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Sumerian epic. Um, so literature, initially transmitted mainly orally. So a good example would be the Vedas, composed between 1500 and 500 BC and written down around 500 BC. As with the other modalities, It serves very many vital functions. So, as a repository of folk memory, for example, as a codification of moral schemas. So, kind of people embedding that, working out their ethic frameworks, embedding it and teaching it and passing it on. You might think of fairy stories, for example, as playing an important role in that respect. And then also, literature helping to shape people's subjectivities. So there's suggestions, for example, that modern modes of self-consciousness have been shaped by, informed by, the structure of the novel and innovations in that respect. Okay, so running through the categories of value again. So obviously, sense-making literature is particularly powerful in that respect, given the kind of symbolic nature of language. So literature being inherently discursive, it's really efficacious in terms of people's sense-making. So there's obviously a large literature on meaning, sense-making, and the importance in that respect of narrative. So people having narratives both in a macro sense, like making sense of life and existence generally, but also a micro sense. So one's own life in particular. So, as people construct and engage with narratives that give them meaning, literature is obviously very powerful in that respect. So whether that's novels or poetry or, you know, obviously religious texts and philosophy help people explain their existence, their social lives. Then there's also the use of, harnessing creative writing, help people process their own lives. So there's been a lot of work on, the efficacy of writing-based interventions, whether that's kind of formal writing therapy or just um, kind of interventions that have been harnessed in positive psychology, which aren't a clinical intervention per se, but it's helping people think about and process their lives by putting it down in writing, making sense of their memories and their emotions. Um, the literature also has the potential, again, for enriching experience. So, for example, drawing attention to dimensions of reality, aspects of their life that they might have gone previously unnoticed. So, there's suggestions, for example, that reading can really help foster empathy and theory of mind. So, the theory of mind is just that you appreciate that other people have their own minds and mental states and perspectives that might be different from one's own. So, reading can really help you give you an insight, a window into other people's lives and what it might be like to live that life. And again, that might be connected to empathy. And people might also discover concealed dimensions of their own lives. So I'm sure you're all familiar with Joseph Campbell and the hero's journey or the heroine's journey or the journey that people can go through. And so some people have suggested that part of the appeal of epics like Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter, is that these memorable portrayals of the hero's journey. But the point is that people don't just see Frodo on his adventure, but realize that people are all on their own journey and they might take some meaning or find some inspiration in the portrayals in literature. But literature can also help people create and explore new realities. So, as I said, glimpsing not just other people's lives, but other times and places. I found a nice quote on this website. I only have one life to live, but in books I can live 1,000 lives. So you can imagine people not just experience, getting a glimpse of other people's existence, but other times and places that could be very meaningful. And we can create new narratives for ourselves through creative writing, such as writing therapy. Aesthetic appreciation. So here you might, for example, really think about poetry, which is particularly aesthetic. Coleridge defined it as the best words in the best order. I'm really interested, for example, in Japanese poetry like haiku. I'm no expert at all, but I'm personally have been very into Buddhism for many years, and Zen Buddhism is fascinating, and the extent to which haiku can represent, expressions of and ways towards spiritual experience. So there's a nice book by Alan Watts talking about Zen and Zen poetry and like the people like Basho, that his haiku can evoke these expressive moods that are really valued in Zen Buddhism and Japanese culture. So, for example, Mono no Aware, I'm sorry about the pronunciation, that's probably not quite correct, but a kind of pathos at the impermanence of life, um, which is obviously the notion of impermanence is central to Buddhism. So the idea, the value of haiku is that they can express these insights into the nature of reality, but also capture and crystallize and reflect the enlightened state of mind that someone like Bashu might have been able to attain. So this pathos, the impermanence of life, would be seen as captured in the haiku. Summer grasses, the only remains of warriors' dreams. Another quality is wabi sabi, which people might be familiar with. To an extent, it's kind of entered kind of English discourse. A kind of desolate, aged beauty, the beauty not found in newness or perfection or symmetry, but in things that could be considered weathered or old or worn, like an aged tree in winter. So Alan Watts suggested this one would be characteristic of wabi sabi. Solitary now, standing amidst the blossoms, is a cypress tree.
We actually have to go and start date.
And Yugen, which and Yugen, so like these other terms, they're strictly considered to be untranslatable. They don't really have exact equivalents in English, but it's been interpreted as a kind of profound, mysterious grace reflected in this haiku. On a withered branch, a crow is perched in the autumn evening. Okay, um, and Rich Shu is just, again, the uh, the fourth category is entertainment. So we read for pleasure, and it doesn't even need to be deep or meaningful literature. It can just be a pleasant distraction. So ludic reading is known as reading for pleasure, from the ludic from the Latin, meaning spontaneously playful. Again, the possibility of becoming entranced, experiencing flow, and again, it doesn't have to be high quality work. It can just help people switch off. It can be found as relaxing and mentally restorative. So there's lots of work around the importance of trying to foster engagement with reading, like storybook exposure and infancy can help develop cognitive skills, and also an enjoyment of writing. And there's also an interesting uh, aspect of literature that can be communal. So, I mean, I know reading can often be a solitary activity, but there's writing and reading groups which have become very popular, whether it's kind of a platform of social and emotional support. Um, so the first literature circle in America is thought to be founded in 1634 as a women's Bible study group, but they become increasingly popular with led by people like Oprah Winfrey. So there's lots of things they can do for people, but they might enable kind of plural reflection and sense making. And then besides reading and writing groups, there's obviously bonding around dramatic performances from theatre to the spoken word. And again, like with music performances, they can open up opportunities for collective flow and participatory consciousness. And then the final modality I just want to cover is drama. I mean, obviously that's to an extent covered in some of the other categories, like literature, but something particularly powerful about um, seeing things come to life on the stage, on the screen. So drama, as with the other modalities, but it's been central to human experience throughout history. Um, like ritual has been central to religious and spiritual traditions. So, analyzed, for example, by Durkheim as the effervescence of ritual experience, helping people join a shared collective existence and internalize group codes, allowing people to participate in oral narratives. So, obviously, still relevant today, whether in kind of religious contexts or national contexts like parading the flags. Um, Again, it can perhaps enable things like plural reflection, reflexivity, part of the way that a group communicates to itself. So as per literature, it's particularly powerful in terms of sense making, hold, as it were, a mirror up to nature, as Hamlet put it. Maybe it's even more potent than literature, because it's heightened by its vividness and immediacy as a spectacle, bringing the literature to life in front of people's eyes. So, for example, many people might prefer to watch a film adaptation than read the original text. There's obviously lots of evolving forms of drama. Um, so, for example, in an American context, reflecting the American dream from plays like Arthur Miller, Death of a Salesman, to films like Scorsese, to work like The Wire by David Simon. So, all different takes on the American dream, you can see an evolution or a development across different types of platforms. Like with the other modalities, it can really enrich experience. So I use the example here of the 2001: A Space Odyssey because that's been analyzed in terms of facilitating transpersonal experiences through experimentation with altered realities and immersive perspectives. It's also interesting here to think about things like magic and the circus, which are really fascinating, like their drama, um, and they can engender curiosity, wonder, and awe. And magic has even been used as a therapeutic intervention. And then also sporting events, a form of mythic spectacle. I don't know. Just as an aside, I'm a huge soccer fan, and honestly, nothing can really rival kind of big sporting events for sheer drama because they're unscripted. Um, and anyway, I'm sure if there are sports fans in the group here, you'll know what I mean. So, they can obviously be analyzed as fulfilling some of the functions of religion, including participatory consciousness, tribal identity. So in that respect, there can be obviously many bad elements, especially as someone coming from the UK, which has had a kind of hooligan problem in relation to soccer. So it's not without its issues, but nevertheless, it can be a powerful, enriching experience for many people. Um, Aesthetic appeal. So obviously, drama, aesthetics is a big part of it. So you can think about the powerful appeal of dramatic idols. Some people have suggested these fulfill similar functions to religious goals. People, it can be problematic, foster damaging expectations about life and how one should be, but nevertheless, aesthetics is a significant part of the appeal of drama. We can savor dramatic excellence. So again, one for the football soccer fans. Think about the respect someone like Lionel Messi gets for his sporting performances. Sport again can capture the interest of hard to reach groups, which is interesting, like adolescent forms. But there's also the conventional art forms like theatre and cinema. Point is, all of these forms of drama, aesthetics are a core part of what makes them appealing. Again, the sheer entertainment value. So film and TV are arguably the dominant form of entertainment in many cultures. Um, it's also interesting to think about comedy. Um, Very entertaining, but also, a mirror for uncomfortable truths, like in shows like The Office. Um, but again, people have just tried to think about what makes things funny, why are funny things appealing. In terms of why things are funny, potentially things like the detection and resolution of incongruity, what functions it serves, maybe as a form of social bonding. Um, Suffice to say, comedy and laughter have a significant entertainment value, which is obviously part of their appeal, but they've also been harnessed in clinical settings and there's comedy-related interventions. And then also, as with the other modalities, there's considerable potential for bonding. So intense group connectivity and identity. So I gave the example of sports spectatorship, but also, as I mentioned, that can be problematic if it fosters a kind of tribal identity. But nevertheless, it's a powerful bonding experience for many people. Socializing with like-minded people, whether that's going to theatre or participating in things like amateur dramatics. And there's a therapeutic perspective too, helping people explore and make sense of experiences together, develop social skills. So it's been used in a therapeutic aspect with various populations, as per the references there. Um, so, sort of in conclusion, the value and the potential of art, for decades, it's been harnessed in more kind of clinically oriented settings, but there's, movements now just make it harness it for more general populations in terms of facilitating well-being and flourishing, whether that's in early education for at-risk youth, vulnerable mental health groups, for prisons, and older adults. So, um, you can make a case that these kinds of, I'm speaking here from a positive psychology perspective. The art has great value as an intervention, as something people do to facilitate their well-being. It can be very cost effective. So part of what I was trying to do in the paper was just encourage the field to take art much more seriously as one of the primary ways in which people can and do seek and cultivate well-being. So with that, I'll just that's the end of the presentation. So I'm keen to hear any comments or questions or reflections, or just open up the space for discussion. I'm sure you will have lots of personal insights into art. So I'm just keen to hear what people, it doesn't have to be questions, just if people want to share their thoughts.
Thank you so much, Tim. I felt so much inspiration throughout the presentation. I guess it's the kind of impact of talking about art, immediately inspires you. Would you mind turning the slides off? And so we can see everybody. All right. And I just want to just get us started because it made me think so much. Like many people in the audience are doing management work related research or practice, and I just realized how much thirst there is that we kind of stop the art. Like it's so prevalent, right? It's everywhere in life. It has so much existential day-to-day significance, as you demonstrated so well. But I feel like when we go to a workplace or when we start working, we kind of stop that artistic side of ourselves or artistic side of life and then move to almost like another way of being. And your presentation reminded the importance of, integrating more of that artistic part of life into the workplaces as well. And I have some comments, but I would like to open it up if anybody would like to ask some questions. I know there have been some really good ones in the chat as well. If anyone wants to go, please raise your hand.
I just saw an interesting question from Susanna. What's the difference between
Yeah,
art and positive art? Is there any negative art?
yeah,
Which is a really good question. Because in fact, I'm just writing a paper this morning because just as a, I don't know if people are aware of the Global Flourishing Study. It's a project that I'm involved with. Um, it's, investigating kind of the nature, experiences and predictors of flourishing across 22 countries, over 200,000 people. One of the items, though, is about people's experiences of beauty, which I really wanted to take on. I haven't got the data yet, but I was keen to take it on. And so I've just been actually this morning trying to write the introduction and making a case for beauty being intrinsic to art. But then I was thinking actually there are examples where some art is not only unconcerned with beauty, but wants to be like anti-beauty. I was thinking, for example, of the Dada movement, where it's this kind of it called itself anti-art, partly because it arose in the context of the First World War and looked at the kind of conventions around art as implicated in some way in what was happening. So it sought to be kind of anti-art and to overturn conventions and to be like deliberately ugly, or just at least not kind of decoupled from beauty. Um, so I suppose negative art might be something that does seek to evoke negative mental states, but maybe deliberately, as in, if you want to show the horrors of war, the mental state you want to evoke would necessarily be negative because, unless you're trying to capture some kind of people's helping other people or something like that. But, in general, if you wanted to kind of show the brutality of war, then art that did that would want to evoke a negative state, but deliberately. But then you might argue then that's serving some larger positive function in as much as it's making people think about morals and ethics and so on. But at least in its immediate affective sense, it might be negative.
interesting. Very interesting. Thank you, Tim. Marty?
Yeah, I agree with what you just said, Tim, and you can also include some of the great artists like Picasso, who said a
Yeah,
lot of his art was to alert people about the rise of Nazism and fascism in Spain. So there
yeah.
are painters that are using their art to alert people to really portending catastrophes. My point, our question that I have for you, Tim, is uh, as a retired psychologist and now a humanist chaplain, I run into a lot of young people in university. And there's a lot of literature out now, particularly the latest book by Jonathan Haidt on the anxious generation, about how there are brain changes happening now with young people, particularly their ability to have attention span and we have an epidemic of ADHD in young people. What have you come across any research by any psychologists or learning disabled experts on how art, particularly like drawing and music, can extend length of attention?
That's a good question. And I mean, the short answer is no, but the kind of the deeper answer is like I'm sure there would, So it's not my, like I said, art's not really my area of expertise. It's just something I'm interested in. So I don't know the literature in depth. But just speaking personally, just on reflection, I'm almost certain that that would be the case. Because art is all about, yeah, taking one sense, taking people out of their kind of maybe kind of short term or distracted mindset, because you have to be focused to engage in art. But then, because it's obviously one thing to tell people just to kind of focus more, but if they're not enjoying it, it's hard to focus. But obviously, the appeal of doing art and especially getting good at art or watching art that people appreciate, um, is the fact that, it can compel you to pay attention, for longer. And I've seen, for example, discussions around the appeal recently of like these really long form podcasts. People talk about short attention spans, and then I'm not a particular fan of Joe Rogan, but it's interesting to think that his podcasts go like 3, 4 hours long and people pay attention for that. So basically, something around if people can find or engage in art that they find meaningful, then it can certainly help them develop these attention spans. So I think there's definitely something to that.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Marty. Tim, I was also thinking there's maybe another angle, another dimension to add to your kind of model, I will say, but where you are in the engagement with the art, like, are you really the one, like, as you're experiencing these values, are you the one who is really consuming it, or like being engaged with it directly, intentionally with art, or you're exposed to it? Sometimes art just happens to you as opposed to you seeking it, right? And then at other times, like, if you are the one who is producing it, or if or creating, maybe you're a restaurant owner and you're creating the environment. So I was thinking it could be really interesting to have that kind of agentic, like, how are you relating to art, and how is that different in terms of the impacts that it has? Does it really make a difference? That could be another dimension too.
Yeah, definitely. Because there's lots to be said around people's own mindset and perspectives.
Mm-hmm.
Because obviously appreciation of beauty isn't just about art per se, but can apply to any phenomena, just walking down the street or being in the natural world. But it's obviously interesting to reflect, and I'm sure people have here have had this experience. You could be walking down one street in a great mood and really attentive to all the beauty that's there. And then on another day be in a bad mood and just completely oblivious or even annoyed at it, perhaps even in some way. So obviously the stimuli is the same, but the mindset one brings to it is completely different. And then you got to think, is there ways to then help people cultivate that kind of appreciative mindset? So obviously, I mean, there's obviously things like mindfulness. Part of my research has been on mindfulness, and that's been studied in terms of its ability to help people be more attuned and attentive to the world around them, including in terms of appreciating its beauty. So I think there's definitely something to be said for helping people think about the way in which just mentally they engage with their surroundings, and the world around them, and then also then providing opportunities for them to like feel empowered to do things artistically, if they can. And there to an extent you've got to think about issues around access and privilege and who had the time and space and resources to engage in art. But then you also want to make the case that, um, it doesn't need to be, um, expensive or prohibitive. And basically trying to find ways that increase people's access and participation in the arts. And I use arts, really broadly too. That's part of why I wanted to talk about things like sport in the talk, and comedy and so on. But just because sometimes people think the arts and they might think opera or ballet and these kind of, certain types of arts, but actually lots of things can be done in an artistic way or just appreciated for their artistic value, and then helping people see that, because again, I mentioned I'm really interested in, I'm just a huge soccer fan, but like helping people appreciate that the aesthetics is part of soccer and of, I'm used to saying soccer now, I live in the US, football. So helping people, particularly like young boys, for example, that could be a way into aesthetics, really, to think about what makes a goal beautiful, what makes a player skillful, and so on. So just trying to find ways to enhance people's awareness and appreciation of art and aesthetics, I think is really helpful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, most artists say art, they live life as art, right? Like it's not that art is something particular to them, that all of life is art to some people.
yeah, like you live artistically. But in a sense, like I suppose all people do that. I was listening to this one interesting podcast, and this one just one was talking about just getting dressed and putting on makeup. And I mean, I think she said she put particular attention to the clothes she wears. But I think even everybody, just the aesthetic choices we make in what we wear, you know, that's an artistic act and a decision, and the way we decorate our house and things we put on our walls. So, we all engage in it in some respect. And I think it's almost just helping people appreciate that they do that anyway. Like they engage in and consume and think about and reflect on art anyway, just like literally in terms of the things they buy, like the decisions they make, why this lamp versus that lamp, or this sofa versus that sofa, and there's artistic decisions, aesthetic decisions there, and helping people. Because what you don't want is people just kind of make it a binary distinction between artists and non-artists, but you kind of want everyone to realize that they sort of are an artist in some respects, and have them kind of cultivate that.
What do you think defines that? Is it the creativity that you do things with, or is it like, what is it exactly? How can the same mundane thing can be art or not? What makes that difference?
I think it's partly the creativity and the decisions involved, but I guess the kind of issues around perception and taste and values. Um, but that's why I was just making the point that, almost everything we engage in has some artistic element or aspect, whether we see it as such. So, that's why I give the example of decorating a house. How do we choose what to put in a house and what to buy? Like aesthetics are at least part of that. We're not just all purely functional. We choose things that we like, and then that's an aesthetic act and an aesthetic decision. And there's creativity involved in a sense. You're being creative with your space, your house, or your workplace. There's aesthetic decisions happening. So helping people to appreciate that they engage in that anyway, rather than you don't want to hear people say, well, I'm not artistic or I'm not creative. I just think everyone is. It's just some people embrace that and have been given kind of opportunities to really develop it. But I just think it's something that we, just by virtue of being human, we all do anyway, in some way.
Mhm. Anybody else? Any questions, thoughts? I know Ravi mentioned the justice element, but I guess that was discussed too. But if you want to comment on that, like what about the seeking of justice through art, he was saying.
Yeah, I think that's a really important aspect or element of art. I mean, obviously, it doesn't have to apply to art, doesn't necessarily apply to art, but I think um, it can certainly be something that art does, and arguably, you could make a case that the more values or functions some art serves, the kind of the more important or valuable or powerful it is. So, and a piece of art that was just merely beautiful is still great. But a piece of art that's beautiful and also motivated some kind of movement towards justice is like even better, potentially. So you could imagine there's kind of layering going on. So not to say that justice has to be an integral element, but you could make a case that if it is, it makes the art that much more valuable. And similarly, for people engaged in kind of issues around justice, to the extent that art can be then brought in, it might kind of make those movements even more efficacious. You think about the great protest movements and then the songs, for example, that were written, the protest songs, that really helped kind of catalyze and crystallize these movements and make them even more effective. Like you would have still had the same movement without the songs, but to the extent they can capture and inspire and move people, then it makes the movement even more powerful. So you'd want to say that even if your primary aim is kind of issues around justice, if you can bring in and harness art, then that's going to help the cause, I would say.
I just want to add, Marty's example, Picasso also falls in that category. But I want to ask a different question. Removing the human agency in the creation or consumption of art. Nowadays we have this artificial intelligence, there's no human agency there. AI doesn't even know what it wants. It only knows what we want it to want. So this AI generated fake stuff, um, as it relates to arts, that's very confusing because sometimes they are neither beautiful or truth seeking or just social justice. So there's a whole new fountain of arts coming from non-human agency. That's
Mm.
what I'm wondering about. Maybe you can comment on that.
Thanks, Larry. Yeah, that's so interesting. I mean, quite honestly, I don't know what to make of it. Because, on the one hand, I think you're right, because it can be kind of devoid of human properties, and I think it can leave people cold. We have a human bias. So if you see a piece of art and then you discover that it's made by an AI, then for me at least, it suddenly becomes often just less interesting or meaningful. Whereas if I know this, the very same piece of art, if I saw it and someone said that's made by a human with a life story and a biography and a situation, then it becomes more meaningful. So I have this kind of human bias that makes me tend to disregard the AI art because I'm not sure to make of it. But then I'm also, we don't know what AI is or is becoming, and if it's its own the nature of its being, the type of entity that it is or is becoming. Um, so I'm also kind of fascinated by that question. I'm not sure what to think of it, but you could imagine, can it create forms of mute? Because obviously, like large language models, they're just basically kind of imbibing everything that humans have done and written and so on. So kind of sort of um, replicating or synthesizing what humans have done. But you can imagine as AI systems take off and become more complex, whether they could create forms of art, forms of music that humans haven't made. They become creative in a sense and then take things in new directions. And then, like, that could be intensely meaningful and important. And I don't know. Um, but you could see it potentially going in that direction. So I think that's going to be one of the important, really almost most interesting questions around art in these coming years. Like with all aspects of life, is like, what does AI mean for this, and how's it going to change what art is and how we experience and engage with art? But anyway, so that's a great question. Thanks, Robbie. Lot to think about with that one.
Mhm. Tim, what do you think? Oh, Marty, you want to ask something?
Yeah, I just want to add to this discussion because of having artists in my family. And I'll just tell you that my daughter is a graphics designer and also a massage therapist. So she has two careers, both very spatially oriented and touch. And she told me that when she went to art school, because she could draw, she had a certain advantage because the entire school was turning to computerized generated images. And she says this was so revolutionary in the art schools. But she says now, without human beings, you can't make these images. So she still believes that creativity of humans is involved, although it doesn't involve drawing. So that is a skill set is being lost among a lot of artists, or not generated. It's not being advanced as much as using AI and computer generated images, which is the future. It's so easy to do.
Yeah, the embodied sensual aspect of it versus the digital aspect of it. What does it mean? Hmm. Yeah, super cool. Thank you so much, Tim. We are by the hour. And I also just want to invite everyone to read uh, Tim's research because in this presentation, I understood why I love your papers so much because they are aesthetically, artistically very potent. And when you read them, it's like reading a book. You're not, sometimes academic articles can be a little bit boring and, stiff, but like Tim's really read like an artistic work. I've just had that insight while listening.
Thank you. That's very nice.
Thank you so much. We're grateful for your time here. And we will post this video online for everybody to follow up, and you can rewatch it and remember some of the insights. Thank you so much, Tim, and everybody for your brilliant comments. Have a wonderful rest of the day.
Thank you. Great to be with you. Thanks.